At 5:47 on the morning of March 18, 1945, First Lieutenant James Hendricks crouched behind the stone wall of a supply depot in the village of Remagen, Germany, gripping the Colt M1911 his platoon had called a museum piece for 3 months. 29 years old, 3-time Missouri State pistol champion, 0 confirmed kills in combat. 6 German commandos were advancing through the pre-dawn fog toward the depot, and Hendricks was the only American standing between them and 4,000 pounds of ammunition waiting to be moved across the Ludendorff Bridge. The Colt weighed 39 ounces loaded. It held 7 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. 8 shots total. The Germans carried MP-40 submachine guns with 32-round magazines, Kar 98K rifles, and at least 2 stick grenades that Hendricks could see from his position. Hendricks' commanding officer had told him to leave the old pistol in his footlocker and carry a standard-issue weapon. The platoon sergeant had asked if Hendricks planned to fight the war with his grandfather's revolver. The supply sergeant who'd seen the Colt during a kit inspection wanted to know if the Army Historical Section knew Hendricks had stolen one of their exhibits. Hendricks carried it anyway. The Germans were 60 yards out now, moving in a staggered column through the fog. They thought the depot was undefended. American forces had pushed east across the Rhine 2 days earlier, leaving only skeleton crews to guard rear area supply points. The main infantry company that should have been securing this position was 3 miles south, clearing German holdouts from a factory complex. Hendricks had drawn solo watch duty because his platoon was short-handed and because Lieutenant Morrison didn't think a supply depot full of boxed ammunition needed more than 1 guard at dawn. The raiders were proving Morrison wrong. Hendricks controlled his breathing and watched them come. If you want to see how Hendricks' obsolete pistol performed against elite German commandos trained in lightning raids, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Hendricks. James Hendricks had acquired the Colt M1911 on September 3, 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. He was 25 years old, working as a machinist in Kansas City, and competing in regional pistol tournaments on weekends. The 1911 had been his father's sidearm during the First World War. Thomas Hendricks, Sergeant, 89th Infantry Division, Meuse-Argonne Offensive, 1918. The elder Hendricks had carried the pistol through 6 weeks of combat and brought it home in his duffel when the war ended. Thomas Hendricks died of pneumonia in January 1941. He left the Colt to his son with a note tucked inside the holster. "This kept me alive when everything else failed. May it do the same for you if you ever need it." James Hendricks needed it on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, when he walked into the Army recruiting station in Kansas City and enlisted. The recruiter asked what skills he had. Hendricks said he was a machinist and a pistol shot. The recruiter said the Army could use both. Hendricks asked if he could carry his personal sidearm in combat. The recruiter laughed and said the Army would issue him everything he needed. Hendricks enlisted anyway. He kept the Colt. Basic training took place at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, winter of 1942. The issued sidearm for officers was the M1911A1, an updated version of Hendricks' pistol. Same caliber, same operating system, minor modifications to the trigger and grip. The drill instructors told the officer candidates that the 1911A1 was the finest combat pistol ever made. Hendricks agreed, but when he unpacked his father's original 1911 on the range, his platoon leader told him to put the antique away and use his issued weapon. Hendricks explained that he had fired 40,000 rounds through this specific pistol over 10 years of competition. He knew its trigger pull, exactly 4.5 pounds. He knew its point of impact at every distance from 7 yards to 50 yards. He knew the feel of its grip and the sound of its action and the way it recoiled into his hand when he fired. The issued 1911A1 was similar, but not identical. In competition shooting, identical mattered. The platoon leader said this wasn't competition shooting. This was combat. Hendricks would use the issued weapon. Hendricks qualified expert with the issued 1911A1. He scored 198 out of 200 possible points on the qualification course, missing perfect only because the front sight on his issued pistol was slightly canted and he hadn't had time to adjust it. His platoon leader asked how Hendricks had learned to shoot like that. Hendricks said his father had taught him, and competition had refined it. The platoon leader asked what Hendricks had scored with his personal Colt during practice. Hendricks said he'd put all 50 rounds into a 4-inch circle at 25 yards. The platoon leader told Hendricks to keep the personal pistol locked up and use the issued weapon. Army regulations required uniformity. Hendricks kept the Colt in his footlocker. He cleaned the issued 1911A1 and carried it through the rest of training. Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia, summer of 1942. Hendricks was commissioned as a second lieutenant in October. His first posting was to the 9th Armored Division, training for deployment to Europe. The division shipped out in August 1944 and landed in France in September. By then, Hendricks had been promoted to First Lieutenant and assigned to a mechanized infantry company attached to Combat Command B. The 9th Armored Division fought through France and Belgium in the autumn of 1944. Hendricks led his platoon in a dozen engagements, mostly small unit actions clearing villages and holding crossroads. He fired his issued 1911A1 exactly 0 times. Most combat took place at rifle range or beyond. Pistols were for officers and vehicle crews, backup weapons, not primary tools. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their winter offensive in the Ardennes. The 9th Armored Division was pulled north to reinforce the collapsing American line. Hendricks' company fought in the Battle of the Bulge for 3 weeks. They held a fuel depot outside Bastogne against German infantry and armor. The combat was close, chaotic, desperate. On December 22, a German soldier appeared in the doorway of the building where Hendricks had established his command post. The German was carrying a Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle. Hendricks was holding a coffee cup. His M1 carbine was leaning against the wall 3 feet away. The German raised the rifle. Hendricks threw the coffee cup at the man's face and lunged for his carbine. The German fired first. The burst went high, stitching holes in the ceiling. Hendricks grabbed the carbine, swung it around, and pulled the trigger. The carbine jammed, failure to feed, probably from mud in the magazine. The German was cycling his rifle's action to clear a jam of his own. Hendricks dropped the carbine and drew his issued 1911A1 from the holster on his hip. He fired twice. Both rounds hit center mass. The German dropped. It was Hendricks' first kill. After the battle, Hendricks field-stripped the 1911A1 and discovered a crack in the slide. The crack was hairline thin, barely visible, but it was there. Metal fatigue, probably from the pistol being dropped or struck during the confusion of combat. The crack would propagate with continued use. Eventually, the slide would fail, possibly at the worst possible moment. Hendricks reported the cracked slide to his supply sergeant. The sergeant said replacements would arrive with the next supply convoy, probably in 2 weeks. Until then, Hendricks should carry his M1 carbine and stay close to his riflemen. Hendricks went to his footlocker that night and retrieved his father's Colt M1911. The original 1911 looked nearly identical to the 1911A1 his men carried, but there were differences. The original had a flat mainspring housing instead of the arched housing of the A1 model. The trigger was shorter. The grip safety had a different profile. Most soldiers wouldn't notice unless they looked closely. Hendricks cleaned the Colt and loaded it with 7 rounds of military ball ammunition. He chambered the 8th round and lowered the hammer carefully, then holstered the pistol. The next morning, his platoon sergeant saw the original 1911 in Hendricks' holster and asked when Hendricks had gotten his slide replaced. Hendricks said he hadn't. The sergeant looked closer at the pistol and noticed the flat mainspring housing. He asked where Hendricks had gotten that pistol. Hendricks said it was his father's. The sergeant wanted to know if that meant Hendricks was carrying a privately owned weapon in combat. Hendricks said it was the same model the Army issued, same caliber, same manual of arms. The sergeant said it wasn't the same, it was older, probably worn out, definitely not on the supply inventory. If Hendricks' personal pistol malfunctioned and got him killed, the sergeant didn't want to explain to the company commander why Hendricks had been carrying unauthorized equipment. Hendricks said the Colt had 40,000 rounds through it without a single malfunction. The sergeant said that meant it was 40,000 rounds closer to failure. Hendricks said his issued 1911 A1 had already failed. The sergeant said a replacement was coming. Hendricks said he'd switch back when it arrived. The sergeant told Hendricks he was being stupid. Hendricks said he was being practical. By January 1945, everyone in the platoon knew Hendricks carried his father's pistol. The nickname started with Private First Class DeMarco, who'd been a gunsmith in civilian life. DeMarco examined the Colt one evening and announced that Hendricks was fighting World War II with a World War I museum piece. The name stuck. Hendricks' platoon called the Colt the museum piece, and they called Hendricks the curator. Lieutenant Morrison, the company executive officer, heard about the personal pistol in February. He summoned Hendricks and told him to surrender the unauthorized weapon to supply and carry issued equipment like every other officer in the division. Hendricks asked if the Colt was mechanically different from the 1911 A1. Morrison said no, but that wasn't the point. The point was uniformity, accountability, and chain of custody. If Hendricks lost a personal weapon, the Army had no record of it and no obligation to replace it. Hendricks said he wouldn't lose it. Morrison said that wasn't the point either. The point was regulations. Hendricks asked which regulation prohibited carrying a mechanically identical weapon of the same model and caliber. Morrison said he'd look it up and get back to Hendricks. Morrison never got back to Hendricks. The Colt stayed in Hendricks' holster. On March 7, 1945, Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. It was the first crossing of the Rhine River by Allied forces, and it changed the course of the war in Europe. Within 24 hours, American infantry and armor were pouring across the bridge into Germany. The Germans counterattacked with everything they had: artillery, aircraft, commandos. Hendricks' company was assigned to guard supply depots on the west bank of the Rhine. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, everything the advancing American forces needed to sustain their drive into Germany. The depots were critical targets. The Germans knew it. On March 17, intelligence reported that German special operations units were infiltrating American rear areas. Small teams, highly trained, tasked with sabotage and assassination. Every supply point was ordered to increase security and maintain 24-hour watches. Hendricks' platoon drew security duty for a depot in the village of Remagen, a stone building that had been a warehouse before the war. The depot held 4,000 pounds of boxed ammunition waiting to be transported across the river. Lieutenant Morrison ordered two-man watches, 4-hour shifts. Hendricks took the 0400 to 0800 shift on March 18. His watch partner was supposed to be Corporal Hayes, but Hayes was in the aid station with dysentery. Morrison said Hendricks could handle the watch alone until Hayes recovered. The main infantry company was only a quarter-mile away if anything happened. Hendricks said fine. He'd handle it. He didn't sleep before the watch. He cleaned his Colt instead, field-stripped it completely, inspected every component, wiped down every surface, reassembled it, and loaded it with 8 rounds of hardball ammunition. The Colt had fired 40,000 rounds in competition and 7 rounds in combat. It had never malfunctioned. Hendricks trusted it the way his father had trusted it in 1918. At 0400, Hendricks walked to the depot and relieved the previous watch. The night was cold, fog rolling in from the river. Visibility was maybe 40 yards. Hendricks positioned himself behind a low stone wall at the southeast corner of the building. The wall gave him cover and a clear view of the southern approach, the most likely avenue for anyone coming from the river. At 0530, the fog thickened. Hendricks couldn't see more than 20 yards. He listened instead. The river was quiet. The bridge was quiet. The village was quiet. At 0543, Hendricks heard something. A sound that didn't belong. Metal scraping stone, very faint, coming from the south. Hendricks drew the Colt and thumbed back the hammer. At 5:47 on the morning of March 18, 1945, First Lieutenant James Hendricks crouched behind the stone wall of the supply depot and identified 6 shapes moving through the fog 60 yards south of his position. The shapes were men. They were moving tactically, staggered column, spacing of about 5 yards between each man. They were dressed in dark clothing, not the Feldgrau gray of regular German infantry. They carried weapons at the ready. No voices, no lights, no unnecessary movement. Professionals. Hendricks remained motionless behind the wall. The Colt was in his right hand, hammer back, finger outside the trigger guard. His left hand rested on the stone wall for stability. He controlled his breathing. Slow inhale through the nose, slow exhale through the mouth. Competition shooting had taught him that breath control was everything. Rapid breathing meant movement, and movement meant missed shots. The Germans closed to 50 yards. Hendricks could see their weapons now. MP-40 submachine guns, at least 3 of them. Kar 98K rifles for the others. One of the men had a satchel slung across his back. Demolition charge, prop. They were here to destroy the ammunition. Hendricks considered his options. He could call out a challenge and order them to halt. They would open fire immediately, and he would be dead in the first burst. He could fire a warning shot to alert the nearby infantry company. By the time help arrived, the Germans would have blown the depot and disappeared into the fog. He could retreat and let them destroy the ammunition. Unacceptable. Or he could engage. 6 men with automatic weapons versus 1 man with a pistol. Poor odds. But Hendricks had one advantage: surprise. The Germans thought the depot was undefended. They were moving without caution, focused on their objective. Hendricks was stationary, positioned in cover, waiting for them to enter his kill zone. He waited. The lead German crossed an invisible line 35 yards from Hendricks' position. Hendricks had decided that 35 yards was the maximum effective range for the Colt against a man-sized target in low light. Closer was better, but 35 yards was workable. He'd hit targets at that distance thousands of times in competition. But competition targets didn't shoot back. Hendricks let the lead man pass. The second German entered the kill zone. Then the third. Hendricks wanted them bunched, committed to their approach, too close to scatter effectively when he opened fire. At 5:51, the fourth German crossed into the kill zone. Hendricks made his decision. He aimed at the lead German. Center mass, high chest. The Colt's sights were barely visible in the pre-dawn light, but Hendricks didn't need to see them clearly. He'd fired this pistol so many times that aiming was instinctive. He aligned the gun with his eye and the target, and his hands knew where to put the barrel. Hendricks squeezed the trigger. The Colt fired. The .45 ACP cartridge generates approximately 356 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. The 230-grain bullet left the barrel at 830 feet per second. Flight time to the target at 35 yards was roughly 1/10 of a second. The lead German jerked and fell forward onto his face. He didn't scream. He didn't try to catch himself. He just dropped. The other 5 Germans froze for half a second, trying to process what had happened. Half a second is an eternity in combat. Hendricks worked the Colt's slide manually, thumbed the safety, racked the slide, released the safety, and acquired the second German in his sights. The man was turning, bringing his MP-40 around toward the sound of the shot. Hendricks fired. The second German dropped. The fog lit up with muzzle flashes. The remaining 4 Germans opened fire, spraying bullets in Hendricks' general direction. The MP-40s made a distinctive sound, a fast ripping noise. The Kar 98K rifles cracked sharply. Bullets struck the stone wall in front of Hendricks, chipping fragments that stung his face. Other rounds snapped through the air above his head. Hendricks dropped flat behind the wall and pressed himself against the cold stone. The volume of fire was overwhelming. He counted in his head, 3 MP-40s, maybe 90 rounds per minute each. That's 270 rounds per minute total. They'd burn through their magazines in about 20 seconds if they didn't control their fire. Hendricks waited. He counted to 8. The firing stopped. The Germans were reloading or repositioning. Hendricks rose up behind the wall and looked for targets. One German had broken left and was sprinting for the corner of the building, trying to flank Hendricks' position. Another was taking cover behind a pile of rubble 40 yards out. The other 2 had gone to ground in the fog and were invisible. Hendricks aimed at the runner. The man was moving fast, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. Hendricks led the movement, exhaled, and fired. Mississippi. The bullet kicked up dirt behind the runner. Hendricks corrected, led more, fired again. Hit. The German stumbled, caught his footing and collapsed. 3 down, 3 remaining. Hendricks ducked behind the wall. A burst from an MP-40 chewed into the stone where his head had been a second earlier. The Germans had spotted his muzzle flash. His position was compromised. Hendricks low-crawled along the base of the wall, moving north toward the opposite corner of the building. He stayed flat, using the wall's cover. Bullets continued to hit the wall at his previous position. Let them waste ammunition. He reached the corner and risked a glance around it. The angle gave him a view of the rubble pile where one German had taken cover. The man was leaning out from behind the rubble, MP-40 pointed at Hendricks' original position, waiting for movement. Hendricks braced the Colt against the corner of the building. Stable position, clear sight picture, 42 yards. He aimed at the exposed portion of the German's torso and fired. The German flinched, dropped the MP-40, and slumped sideways. 4 down, 2 remaining. Hendricks heard movement to his right, boots on gravel, coming fast. One of the Germans had circled around the depot and was closing from the north side. Close. Maybe 15 yards. Hendricks spun, bringing the Colt up. The German was already there, MP-40 leveled, finger on the trigger. Both men fired simultaneously. Hendricks felt something punch his left shoulder, hard, hot, immediate pain. His first thought was that he'd been hit. His second thought was that he needed to keep shooting. He fired again. And again. 2 more rounds into the German at point-blank range. The man went down in a heap. 5 down, 1 remaining. Hendricks dropped back behind the wall and checked his shoulder. His uniform was torn. Blood was soaking through. But his arm still worked. He could move it, raise it, make a fist. The bullet had grazed him, cutting a shallow furrow across the outer deltoid. Painful but not incapacitating. He had 2 rounds left in the Colt. 1 in the chamber, 1 in the magazine. Where was the 6th German? Hendricks scanned the fog. Nothing. No movement, no sound. The 6th man was either dead, retreating, or waiting for an opening. Then Hendricks remembered the satchel. The demolition charge. The 6th German wasn't trying to kill Hendricks. He was trying to complete the mission. Blow the depot. If Hendricks was wounded or distracted, that was enough. Hendricks looked toward the depot's main entrance. The door was 20 yards from his position, partially obscured by fog. He couldn't see anyone near it. Then he saw the shadow. A shape moving low and fast toward the door. The 6th German. Hendricks stood and fired. The range was maybe 25 yards, the target moving, the light poor. Not an easy shot. The Colt barked. The German staggered but didn't fall. Hit but not a solid hit. The man kept moving toward the door. Hendricks had 1 round left. He ran. His legs were stiff from crouching, his shoulders screaming in pain, but he ran. The German reached the door and pulled the satchel off his back. Hendricks closed the distance to 15 yards. The German saw him coming. The man dropped the satchel, grabbed a Luger pistol from his belt, and raised it toward Hendricks. Hendricks stopped, planted his feet, brought the Colt up with both hands, and fired his last round. The German's head snapped back. He fell against the door and slid to the ground. 6 down. Mission complete. Hendricks stood in the fog with his empty pistol and waited for his hands to stop shaking. At 6:02 on the morning of March 18th, Sergeant First Class Paul DeMarco and 4 riflemen from Hendricks' platoon arrived at the depot at a dead run. They'd heard the gunfire from their position a quarter-mile away and assumed the depot was being overrun. What they found was First Lieutenant James Hendricks sitting on the ground with his back against the stone wall, bleeding from the shoulder, an empty Colt M1911 resting on his lap. 6 dead German commandos were scattered around the depot in tactical positions. Spent brass casings littered the ground near Hendricks' original firing position. DeMarco skidded to a stop and stared. "Sir, what the hell happened?" Hendricks looked up at him. "Germans tried to blow the depot." "Where's the rest of your watch?" "There was no rest of the watch. Just me." DeMarco looked at the bodies. Counted them. Looked back at Hendricks. "You did this alone?" "Yes." With that, DeMarco pointed at the Colt. Yes. DeMarco walked to the nearest body. The German was maybe 30 years old, dressed in dark fatigues with no insignia. He had an MP-40 submachine gun lying next to him and a combat knife strapped to his boot. DeMarco checked the man's equipment. High-quality gear. Military-issue compass, waterproof map case, fragmentation grenades. This wasn't a regular infantryman. This was someone trained for special operations. DeMarco checked the other bodies. All of them had similar equipment. All of them had been shot with a pistol, single-entry wounds, center mass or head. Precise shooting. No wasted bullets. Sir, DeMarco said, how many rounds did you fire? Hendricks thought about it. 11. 11 rounds. 6 men. Some took more than one hit. One I missed completely on the first shot. DeMarco walked back to Hendricks. He looked at the Colt. That museum piece just saved this entire depot. I know. You're bleeding. I know that too. DeMarco shouted for the platoon medic. Private Miller came running with his aid bag. He cut away Hendricks' uniform shirt and examined the shoulder wound. The bullet had torn a 2-inch gash across the deltoid muscle. Deep enough to bleed heavily, shallow enough to miss anything critical. Miller cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, and bandaged it tightly. You need stitches, sir. And probably a tetanus shot. But you'll live. Hendricks nodded. Thanks, Miller. By 06:30, half the company had arrived at the depot. Lieutenant Morrison pushed through the crowd and found Hendricks still sitting against the wall, now with his shoulder bandaged and his uniform shirt draped over his lap. Morrison stared at the scene, bodies, brass, blood, and tried to process it. Hendricks, what happened? DeMarco answered before Hendricks could. Lieutenant Hendricks engaged and eliminated 6 enemy commandos attempting to destroy the ammunition depot, sir. Solo defense. All targets neutralized with 11 pistol rounds. Morrison looked at Hendricks. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. How did you? Morrison stopped, noticing the Colt on the ground next to Hendricks. He picked it up, examined it, recognized the flat mainspring housing. You used the personal weapon. Yes, sir. The one I told you to turn in. Yes, sir. Morrison looked at the pistol, then at the bodies, then at Hendricks. He handed the Colt back. Good shooting, Lieutenant. Thank you, sir. Morrison turned to DeMarco. Sergeant, secure the area. Collect enemy weapons and equipment for intelligence. Get Lieutenant Hendricks to the aid station. Yes, sir. Morrison walked away. He didn't mention the unauthorized weapon again. By 0800, a military intelligence officer arrived to examine the German bodies and equipment. Captain Lawrence, G2 section. He spent 20 minutes inspecting the dead commandos, checking their papers, photographing their faces. When he finished, he found Hendricks in the aid station getting his shoulder stitched. Lieutenant Hendricks? Yes, sir. Captain Lawrence, Division Intelligence. I need to ask you some questions about this morning's engagement. Of course. Lawrence pulled out a notebook. How did you detect the enemy approach? Sound. I heard metal scraping stone. What time? Approximately 0543. How many enemy combatants did you observe? 6. Can you describe their weapons and equipment? Hendricks described everything he'd seen: MP-40s, Car 98KS, grenades, satchel charge, dark fatigues, professional movement. Lawrence wrote it all down. What was your engagement range? First shot was approximately 35 yards. Closest engagement was about 15 yards. How many rounds did you fire? 11. How many hits? 10. I missed one shot when the target was running. Lawrence did the math in his head. 10 hits, 6 men. Some targets required multiple hits. 3 of them. 2 hits each. What weapon did you use? Colt M1911, .45 ACP. Lawrence looked at Hendricks' holster. The Colt was back in it, cleaned and reloaded. Is that the weapon? Yes, sir. May I see it? Hendricks drew the pistol, dropped the magazine, cleared the chamber, and handed it to Lawrence. The captain examined it closely. He noticed the flat mainspring housing, the shorter trigger, the worn bluing on the slide. This isn't standard issue. No, sir. It's an original 1911. My father carried it in the First World War. Lawrence worked the slide. The action was smooth, no grit, no hesitation. He checked the barrel. He handed it back to Hendricks. Your father's pistol just stopped 6 elite German commandos from destroying a critical supply depot. Yes, sir. How long have you been carrying it? Since January. Has anyone objected? Hendricks smiled slightly. Several people, sir. Lawrence smiled back. I imagine those objections have stopped. I imagine so, sir. Lawrence closed his notebook. I'll be recommending you for a commendation, Lieutenant. What you did this morning was exceptional work. Thank you, sir. One more question. Why did you fire 11 rounds instead of 8? The 1911 holds 7 in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. I reloaded after the 4th shot. When the Germans took cover and I repositioned. Under fire? Yes, sir. Lawrence shook his head. Exceptional work, he repeated and left. By evening, the story had spread through the entire division. Lieutenant Hendricks, the officer who carried his father's museum piece pistol, had fought off 6 German commandos alone at dawn and saved 4,000 pounds of ammunition from being blown to pieces. The officers who'd mocked the Colt stopped mocking. The enlisted men who'd called it an antique stopped calling it that. The supply sergeant who'd wanted to confiscate it never mentioned it again. Hendricks' platoon started calling the Colt something else. They called it the Remagen Special. On March 21st, Hendricks was summoned to division headquarters. Major General John Leonard, commanding officer of the 9th Armored Division, wanted to meet the lieutenant who'd defended the depot. Hendricks reported to Leonard's office with his shoulders still bandaged. Leonard stood, shook Hendricks' good hand, and gestured to a chair. Sit down, Lieutenant. Hendricks sat. Leonard opened a folder on his desk. I've read Captain Lawrence's report, and Lieutenant Morrison's after-action summary, and Sergeant DeMarco's witness statement. All 3 accounts agree. You engaged 6 enemy combatants alone, with a pistol, and eliminated all 6 before they could complete their mission. Yes, sir. How did you learn to shoot like that? My father taught me, sir. And I competed in pistol matches for 10 years before the war. With that particular weapon? Yes, sir. Leonard nodded. Captain Lawrence tells me you've been carrying that pistol since January, against orders from your company executive officer. The orders were not explicit, sir. Lieutenant Morrison asked me to turn in the weapon, but never issued a direct order. I made a judgment call. A good judgment call, as it turns out. Thank you, sir. Leonard leaned back in his chair. Here's the situation, Lieutenant. Division is forwarding a recommendation to First Army that you receive the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Your actions on March 18th prevented the destruction of critical supplies and possibly saved American lives. That recommendation will be approved. I appreciate that, sir. However, Leonard continued, there's a complication. Army regulations state that officers will carry only authorized equipment unless specifically exempted by competent authority. Your personal pistol is not on the division's property book. Technically, you were in violation of regulations when you engaged those commandos. Hendricks said nothing. Leonard smiled. Fortunately, I am competent authority. Effective immediately, you are authorized to carry your personal Colt M1911 as your primary sidearm for the duration of hostilities. That authorization will be entered into your service record. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Lieutenant. You earned it. Dismissed. Hendricks stood, saluted, and left. The Silver Star was awarded in a ceremony on April 2, 1945. The citation read, For gallantry in action on March 18, 1945, near Remagen, Germany. First Lieutenant James E. Hendricks, while serving as lone sentry at a critical ammunition depot, detected and engaged 6 enemy commandos attempting to destroy the depot. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Lieutenant Hendricks eliminated all 6 enemy combatants, preventing the destruction of vital supplies and demonstrating extraordinary courage and skill. His actions reflect great credit upon himself and the military service. The ceremony was attended by Hendricks' entire platoon, Lieutenant Morrison, Captain Lawrence, and Major General Leonard. When Leonard pinned the medal to Hendricks' uniform, the platoon gave him a standing ovation. After the ceremony, Private DeMarco approached Hendricks. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead, DeMarco." "When you were behind that wall with 6 Germans shooting at you, were you scared?" Hendricks thought about it. "Yes." "But you didn't run." "No." "Why not?" Hendricks looked at the Colt in his holster. "Because my father carried this pistol through worse. And he didn't run either." DeMarco nodded. "Must be a good pistol." "It is." On April 10, 1945, Hendricks' company was tasked with clearing German holdouts from a town called Westerburg, 40 miles east of the Rhine. House-to-house fighting, brutal and close. Hendricks used the Colt twice that day. The first engagement happened at 1,130 hours. Hendricks' platoon was clearing a 2-story building that had been a bakery. Hendricks entered through the front door with DeMarco and 2 riflemen. The ground floor was clear. They moved upstairs. A German soldier was waiting in a bedroom at the top of the stairs. He opened fire with a Kar 98K as Hendricks came through the doorway. The bullet missed by inches. Hendricks drew the Colt and fired twice. Both rounds hit. The German collapsed. The second engagement happened at 1,520 hours. Hendricks was moving between buildings when 3 German soldiers appeared from an alley 20 yards away. They raised their rifles. Hendricks drew and fired 4 times, dropping all 3 before they could get a shot off. When the fighting in Westerburg ended that evening, Hendricks had used 6 rounds from the Colt. 6 rounds, for enemy soldiers dead. The pistol had performed flawlessly. By late April, the war in Europe was collapsing. German forces were surrendering en masse. The 9th Armored Division pushed east into Czechoslovakia, accepting surrenders and securing territory. Combat engagements became rare. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hendricks had carried his father's Colt through 6 months of combat. He had fired it in anger 17 times. He had killed 10 enemy soldiers with it. The pistol had never malfunctioned. Not once. On May 10, Lieutenant Morrison approached Hendricks in the platoon area. Morrison was holding a wooden crate. "This came for you from Division Supply." "What is it?" Morrison opened the crate. Inside was a brand new Colt M1911A1, still packed in cosmoline. "Your replacement sidearm. The one I ordered back in December when your issued pistol cracked its slide." Hendricks looked at the new pistol. Then at the worn 1911 in his holster. "I don't need it anymore." "I know," Morrison said. "But I thought you should have it. Just in case." "In case of what?" "In case something happens to your father's pistol. So you'll have a backup." Hendricks took the crate. "Thank you, sir." Morrison nodded. "For what it's worth, I was wrong about that museum piece. I'm glad you didn't listen to me." "So am I, sir." The 9th Armored Division remained in Europe through the summer of 1945, performing occupation duties. Hendricks never fired the Colt again in combat. He cleaned it every week, the same ritual he'd followed for 15 years. Field strip, inspect, oil, reassemble. On October 15, 1945, Hendricks was discharged from the Army at Fort Dix, New Jersey. His final rank was First Lieutenant. His decorations included the Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Infantryman Badge. His service record noted that he was authorized to carry personal weapon, Colt M1911, serial number 83947. Hendricks took the train back to Kansas City. The Colt was in his duffel, wrapped in an oilcloth, exactly the way his father had carried it home from France in 1919. James Hendricks returned to his job as a machinist in Kansas City in November 1945. He married in 1947. He and his wife, Eleanor, had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Hendricks never spoke about Remagen. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to the other veterans at the VFW hall. When people asked what he'd done in the war, he said he'd been an infantry officer in Germany. When they asked if he'd seen combat, he said yes. When they asked for details, he changed the subject. The Colt stayed in a lockbox in his closet. Hendricks cleaned it once a year, on March 18th, the anniversary of Remagen. Otherwise, he didn't touch it. In 1952, Hendricks' oldest son, Thomas, named after his grandfather, asked about the pistol. He was 10 years old and fascinated by war stories. Hendricks took the Colt out of the lockbox and let Thomas hold it. "This was your grandfather's," Hendricks said. "He carried it in the First World War." "Did you carry it too?" "Yes." "Did you shoot anyone with it?" Hendricks considered how to answer. "Yes." "How many?" "Enough." Thomas handed the pistol back. "Were you scared?" "Yes." "But you did it anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Hendricks looked at the Colt. "Because sometimes being scared doesn't matter. Sometimes you have to do the job anyway." Thomas nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the weight of the answer. Hendricks put the Colt back in the lockbox. In 1968, when Thomas was 26 and facing the draft for Vietnam, he asked his father for advice. Hendricks told him 3 things. First, do your duty. Second, take care of your men. Third, if you're going to carry a weapon, make sure you know how to use it. Thomas asked if he could take the Colt to Vietnam. Hendricks said no. The Colt had been through 2 wars already. It had earned its rest. Thomas went to Vietnam with an M1911A1 issued by the Army. He came home in 1970 with a Bronze Star and a permanent limp from shrapnel. He never asked about the Colt again. James Hendricks died on November 12, 1998. He was 82 years old. Heart failure, quick and painless. His obituary in the Kansas City Star mentioned that he was a decorated veteran of World War II, but it didn't mention Remagen. His family didn't know the story. After the funeral, Thomas found the lockbox in his father's closet. Inside was the Colt M1911, still wrapped in oilcloth, still clean and functional after 80 years. There was also a folded piece of paper. Thomas unfolded it. It was his grandfather's note from 1941. "This kept me alive when everything else failed. May it do the same for you if you ever need it." Beneath that, in his father's handwriting, was a second note. It did. March 18, 1945. Remagen. 6 Germans, 11 shots. It never failed. Thomas didn't know what that meant. He took the pistol and the note to the local VFW hall and asked if anyone recognized the name Hendricks or the story about Remagen. One of the older veterans, a man who'd served in the 9th Armored Division, recognized both. "Your father was a legend," the veteran said. "We all heard about what he did. 6 commandos, alone with a pistol. Nobody could believe it. Why didn't he ever talk about it? Some men don't. They do the job, come home and move on. Your father was one of those." Thomas donated the Colt to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 2001. The pistol is displayed in a case with a placard that reads, "Colt M1911, serial number 83947. Carried by Sergeant Thomas Hendricks, 89th Infantry Division, World War I, and First Lieutenant James Hendricks, 9th Armored Division, World War II. Used to defend ammunition depot at Remagen, Germany, March 18, 1945. Most visitors walk past the case without stopping. It looks like any other vintage pistol. Dark bluing worn smooth from decades of handling, grips polished from use, no special engravings or features. But it's not any other pistol. It's the pistol that 2 men carried through 2 wars. The pistol that fired 40,000 rounds in competition without a single malfunction. The pistol that killed 6 German commandos in 6 minutes at dawn. The pistol that proved a father's promise to his son. "This kept me alive when everything else failed." The Colt M1911 served the United States military from 1911 to 1985, a span of 74 years. It was carried by millions of soldiers in 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam. It developed a reputation for absolute reliability and devastating stopping power. The .45 ACP cartridge it fired became legendary for its ability to stop enemy combatants with a single shot. But the 1911's real legacy isn't its mechanical design or its service record. It's the men who carried it. Men like Thomas Hendricks, who survived the Meuse Argonne with the Colt on his hip. Men like James Hendricks, who stood alone at Remagen with 8 rounds and refused to let 6 trained commandos complete their mission. The museum placard doesn't mention that James Hendricks' platoon mocked the Colt for 3 months. It doesn't mention that his commanding officer ordered him to turn it in. It doesn't mention that Army regulations said he shouldn't have been carrying it at all. It just says he used it to defend the depot at Remagen. Sometimes that's all the story you need. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people, and these stories deserve to be told. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who proved themselves with skill and courage when everyone else doubted them. Real people, real heroism, real history. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure men like James Hendricks and Thomas Hendricks don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered. And you're helping make that happen.